It's important to start understanding what data really represents. When you look at information that is managed by organizations, generally they are represented by what's called a data point. A data point represents a certain specific piece of information about you. For instance, your name or your date of birth or the place where you were born. We have historically developed this impression that data is this ethereal thing that is floating in the air, somehow emotionally disconnected from it ourselves. And the truth is very much the opposite. And I'm going to give you an example so you can understand what I'm trying to explain. If I give you a value and I do not provide you the context of that value, you will not know exactly what I'm talking about. And on top of that, you will not have a specific use and therefore a commercial value or personal value towards that data point. So if I tell you 50 means nothing, because 50 can represent a lot of things. If I tell you 50 years, you'll say, okay, it's measuring an age. Measuring an age of what? And I'm telling you 50 years of a person. And say, okay, so now it's 50 years for a person. Are you measuring the time they have been alive or the time they have been working for a company? And I'm telling you, so it's the time they are working for a company. So what you realize is that you need to fully contextualize a certain data point so that you can understand what it represents and what's the value of it. And the moment that you have created that connection, you realize that you can't actually sever it anymore. The moment that you decontextualize that information again, it loses all the value that it had in the first place. Therefore, the argument is to be made that you are your data. Data is not something that is just floating out there, it is actually you. And we have to start considering as part of us if we want to start having a good perspective on how we're going to be protecting it. So you have a number of elements that are all just confluing in that question. First is the obligation that you have to accept terms of use that most of the time people are not understanding before they get to use a specific platform. And it goes to the point where if you do not accept sharing your data with the platform will not provide to you whichever service that they are providing. In this case, Facebook, sharing your posting your experiences and finding friends and whatnot. We have to ask ourselves the question that if they are forcing us to accept exchanging our data in exchange of those services, there has to be some implied value into it. And maybe for people to have a better understanding of that connection that they have with the data, let's say, for instance, I would like people to imagine how would it feel if I clone them a few times. I chop their limbs and send some of those limbs to the US, another piece of them to China, another one to India, for instance. Okay? I don't think anyone will feel very, very comfortable with it. And yet that's exactly the kind of attitude that we have towards our data. We allow it to be disseminated all over the place. And we really have to make up your minds on the fact that that data is basically modeling you. And by modeling you, they learn elements of your personality, of who you are, the people that you interact with, and that, in the hands of the wrong people, it's a very, very dangerous power. So there's two parts for that particular element, because the current conversation tends to steer too much weight into the shoulders of the users and sort of removes the responsibility of governments, which are the ones who are enacting the provisions necessary to protect your own citizens. So if I go back to the example or to the premise that I am my data, governments tend to have, depending on the country of course, they tend to have constitutional obligations based on the constitutional law that they have enacted, and more often than not they have duties of care towards the citizens. If you can actually understand that the data has no separation whatsoever from the citizen itself, turns out that those duties of care also apply to the data. Therefore, you need to have in place regulations as well that are going to protect that. And the reason why you do that, it's because you can't expect citizens to understand how to protect themselves in every single service and product that they are exposed with. For instance, no citizen knows how a seatbelt works, and they shouldn't have to know. They also don't know how to test if the seatbelt is actually compliant with regulations or not, and they shouldn't have to. At most, they sit in the car, it works, there you go. So there is two elements on every single service and product that you get, which is what the government takes care of, because the amount of resources, of knowledge and energy that you need to put into is very specialized, and it's beyond the purview of a specific individual, a small community, and the training or the knowledge that the individual gets on itself in order to know the last mile usage of any service and product. You have governments because as an individual you cannot build a road. Okay? So it's essentially the idea of putting together a number of resources to take care of things that a small community or a single individual cannot take care of. Mm-hmm. Right? So it's basically transposing that kind of responsibility. Yeah. Now, back to the example of the seat belts, it's the responsibility of the government to make sure the seat belts actually are in the cars and that they are safe. No matter the complexity of the legal requirements or the technical requirements for the seat belts, the user that is using the seat belt is unaware of it and should not concern him or herself about it. Same goes for technology. That's the interesting contradiction. We are expecting them to know about their digital rights and to know how to implement them and how to, and all of a sudden everyone seems to be needing to be a hacker. Yeah. Well, no, it's not the way to go. It's too much pressure, and all of those things should be much more on the infrastructure part, taken care by the government, and it should be transparent for the user. Well, when was last time that human rights were equal to money? That's the simple. It's much more complex than that. Yeah. That is, however, the easy way to see it. I mean, if you are trying to protect your citizens, a system based on money is not really going to work. It has to be a system that is based on principles, and specifically on embracing whatever are the standards in terms of human rights, which at this very moment it's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So yes, in the sense that you can try to have some financial control over entities whose sole language is money. Mm-hmm. Sure. Is that necessarily going to make them change perspective? Not necessarily, because they can just budget for it. So for as long as you have organizations which business model is based on not following human rights guidelines, you will have the same thing, and no tax is ever going to be changing that.